You know when you're playing a game and the music is just... Ooh. Sometimes I'll go back to a game and leave it on the main menu just to listen to it. I don't know what it is about music, it just has this magic. It just invigorates the gaming experience. Oh, you're here. Hi, my name's Raymond. I'm a video game developer working on Project Feline, an anime-inspired game with wall running, rail grinding, and catgirls. I've been developing this game for a number of years, focusing on the core gameplay loop and making sure that the game is actually fun. People seem to be enjoying the game, so I've been moving away from prototyping towards a vertical slice demo that better captures the vibe of what I'm trying to make. I started with refactoring the character's movement to feel much smoother, and in the last devlog I talked about the new environment I developed to facilitate this new movement. But even with the new movement, the new environment, it still feels like there's something missing. And what's missing? There's no jams. So with only a few days left before my milestone was due, I composed my own track to go along with this new environment. I composed this demo in under 2 days using Logic Pro. And in this devlog, we're gonna dive into my project files and see how this track was put together. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we begin, I'm still playing around and trying to find the voice for Project Feline. So I'm going to be making a lot of demos in future to try out different genres, different tempos, and that sort of thing, just to find what fits. I haven't studied music. I don't really do music theory. I tend to do things by ear or by intuition. So usually when I go into one of these tracks, I don't have a particular exact idea in mind of how I want it to sound in terms of its melody or its arrangement, but I'll have more of an idea on the general sound, the instruments, and the overall vibe of the track. If I had to put a name on the genre, I guess I'd call it electronic. I know it's a very broad genre, but I think that's the closest thing I can come up with. I want to try making a few more ambient tracks later on, but this one is definitely more fast-paced. And I may not make all of the tracks like this, but I thought for this mission, it would fit. So this is what the track looks like in Logic Pro. With a lot of the music I listen to, I tend to be able to break it down into different categories, like drums, or chords, or bass, or rhythm, and so on. And that's how I tend to structure my tracks as well. So I've grouped all of these tracks into different categories based on those elements. So I've got the red regions for bass, the blue regions for chords, the yellow regions for drums, the green regions for effects, the purple regions for melody, the dark purple regions for pads, and the region at the bottom here for rhythm and arpeggiators. Now, depending on the track, I will start at different points, but for this one, I started with the chords. So if we look into the chords, we'll see how I've done these. What I've done to create these is what's called a MIDI track. And a MIDI track allows you to basically pick an instrument you want and play notes on it. Now, I don't have the best piano skills, although sometimes I do try and play something out on a keyboard. But for this track, I just drew the notes by hand by using the command key and the mouse and just dragging different notes onto the piano roll. So here were the chords I did for this track. So these chords will play out through the majority of the track I've got. Usually when I start a song, I don't really know exactly how it'll turn out, but I have a rough idea in my head on the general sound of the instruments I want. So for these chords, I wanted a rough, grungy guitar sound, but I can't play a guitar, so I had to do some workarounds. The actual instrument itself is just an ES2 synth preset, and this is how it sounds on its own. So it doesn't sound anything like a guitar, but if I add a few of these effects on it, it'll start to sound more similar. So the first effect I added was this distortion effect, which kind of just like blows out a lot of the frequencies and kind of makes it sound a lot more full. I also then added a pedal board effect, which I think really sells the sound. So those are the main chords, but a bit later on I have these other chords that come in, and they sound like this. To create the strings, I just used the default ESX2 cello preset, and they sound like this. I also have this plucky synth playing over the top as well. So that's what I started with for this track. After I did the chords, I then went on to add some drums and beats. So these yellow regions are my drums. I have a few different tracks going on here. The first thing you'll hear in this track is this Amen break drum loop. So to create that, I have this drum loop going for the first few bits, but I have a few effects on it because I didn't want the drums to be too full on at the beginning of the song. I wanted them to feel like they had been phased in or something. By default, on their own, the drums would sound like this. But with the effects I added, I got more of the sound I wanted. So I first added a bit of EQ, I then added a bit of overdrive, which makes the drums sound much more crunchier. And then after adding overdrive, I added a high pass filter, which essentially cuts off any frequency below the amount you set it. So only the high frequencies are being left in. And as a result, you get a sound like this. Now, in addition to those effects, I also have some stereo spread going on because I wanted it to come from one ear and then slowly fade into the middle of the mix. And to do that, I did something called automation. And this is kind of like an animation timeline, and it basically allows me to animate different properties of the sound along the timeline of the track. So in this case, I animated the stereo pan property to start out a bit more to the left of the track. And then by the time it gets to about here, it starts to slowly fade towards the middle. And then it kind of embellishes and fills in. So to create that fill part at the end here, this was quite fun. I have another part of the loop fade in at this part just to kind of embellish the breaks a bit more. So that'll start fading in like this. And then in addition to that, I have my kick samples playing as well. And this is how they sound. So the first kick drum I have playing is this one. And I like this one because it sounds like it's being punched almost with the drums. The second drum track I have is this, which fills in a bit more of the lower frequencies. I then have this third one playing as well, which takes up this tinny noise in the high frequencies. But all together with the rest of the drums, they sound like this. And then when the song starts to ramp up, these are what the drums sound like. So they're quite repetitive. There's just a drum loop for like a bar just going over. But I've tried to embellish this loop a bit with my own kicks and snares as well. And you can see it has this kind of punchy reverb sound to it because I really wanted to make the kicks feel more impactful. I also have the snare sample that plays over the top. That's how it sounds all together. Later on in the track, the drums change a bit because I want the drums around here to take a bit of a backseat to the mix and allow for the chords to take the center stage. So I've done a bit of a different job with the drums on this part of the track. The main meat of this part of the drums is the drummer samples on this track. Now to create this, I used a feature in Logic called the drummer, which essentially allows you to generate a drum track with a few properties. And this was really fun to use. This is the preset I was using for this part of the track. And the cool part about this compared to a traditional drum loop is that you get a lot of control and customization over it. So if we paste that down here, we actually get a lot of control over how these drums are played. And we can select from a few presets on the side here. So if I select one of these presets, you'll see that the waveform on the drum track actually changes. And this is how it sounds. Now, if we want, we can change how complex and how loud and soft this mix is as well. We can also tell it what parts of the drums to use. So we can tell it to use percussion, we can tell it to use cymbal clashes, we can even tone down different parts of it or ramp up certain parts of it. So when I am stuck for drum ideas, this is usually where I start. If we play the drums with the chords, this is how it will sound. And I mean, it sounds okay, but I feel like it's just a bit flat. Something doesn't quite feel right. So what I have in addition to this is another drum track with just the kick drum playing. And I use this to compress the rest of the track so that when the kick drum is played, the chords or the bass or the rhythm or melody will compress to allow the drums to take more prominence. And this is done using sidechaining and a compressor. So if I go to the chords, for example, you can see that I've routed them through this auxiliary bus channel with a compressor on them. And this compressor is configured to follow this kick drum track. This technique is used a lot in EDM music, where you have chords that bounce along with the kick drum to get that kind of bouncy wave effect on the different synths. And I tend to use it a lot in my music as well. If you want to hear how the compression sounds on its own, this is what it will sound like. And without the compressor, it sounds like this. So you can see with the compressor, it kind of just ducks the rest of the audio to allow the kick drum to take center stage. And yeah, I don't know, it just adds a bit more juice and liveliness to the track. In addition to drums, there's another really important part of the track, and that is the different effects that I use. So these by themselves will not sound too special, but I feel that they add a lot of polish to the track. So this is how they sound on their own. So you can see that they doesn't really sound like music anymore, it just sounds like sound effects, but having these sound effects in really helps different parts of the song transition together. So this is how this loop would sound like without effects. You can see it's a bit sudden, but if we add the effects in, see that the transition is much smoother. Now, there was a few extra things I did on this track, and I usually never do this, but I thought it'd be fun to experiment with a few vocal samples for this one, and this is how they sound. And I don't know, I hear vocal samples used a lot in like EDM music and stuff, and I just thought it'd be kind of fun to try. So to create these, I looked into the Apple Loops library, found some vocals that I liked, and dragged it in and started cutting it up. There are actually a lot of vocal samples that come with Logic that you can use, and this is how some of them sound. And if you're a fan of Sonic Freeriders, you may recognize these samples. Anyway, so to create that section, I basically just took this sample and just cut up certain bits of it and put them together like this. So on their own, they sound really weird, but in context with the rest of the track, they sound like this. So moving on from the effects, we have the melody track. Now, when it comes to music, I tend not to pay that much attention to melodies. I tend to focus more on like the rhythms and drum loops and that sort of thing. So I tend not to have a melody in mind when composing a track. It's usually something I get to at the end. But I knew I needed something prominent and something that stood out to kind of break up the loopiness a bit of the rest of the track. So I wanted a nice lead guitar sound, but because I can't play guitar, I had to resort to finding a sample that sounded like what I wanted to. I may change this later, but this is what I have for the moment. And I basically just took this guitar loop and tried to break it up in different sorts of ways, just to kind of break the flow up a bit and see what I could get out of it. Now this part at the end here I was pretty happy with, so I wanted this cool choppy effect for when the melody ended and transitioned to the next part of the track. So to do this, I put this part on its own track and added a tremolo effect to it. And a tremolo can do a lot of things, but I used it in this case to make this cool gated sound. And you can change some of these other properties. You can make the transitions very smooth if you want and give it this cool stereo spread effect. But I wanted it very choppy, very sharp, and very visceral. So again, on its own, it doesn't sound all too powerful, but in context with the rest of the track, it sounds like this. Now, a bit later in the track, I did some of my own MIDI data down here, and it sounds like this. And to do this bit, I just basically, like the others, put notes down on the piano roll and just did what felt right. This instrument is actually just an electric piano, and this is what it sounds like without all the effects. So to get it to sound more like a guitar, I added the pedal board effect once again. But it still sounded a little dry, so I decided to add some stereo delay and reverb as well. And those, I think, just add so much more warmth and atmosphere to the track. Stereo delay is one of my favorite effects because it basically adds these cool bouncy contrails to whatever note you play. And if I pause it there, you can hear the echo dying down, which, I don't know, I just love it. It's one of my favorite effects. So moving on from the melody, we have the pads. Now, I don't use a lot of pads in this track, but I think they do a bit to fill some of the dead air in the more quieter parts of the song. And this is how the pads sound. So these are just 3 different pads that I've used that all play at different times. The first one I've added is this cool little plucky sounding one. And you can see to create this one, I just copy pasted the MIDI data from the chords, which I've also done for the other pads, except for these other ones, I've extended all of the notes to feel nice and soothing. So this is what the second pad sounds like. And then a bit later on, I've got this cool gated pad that comes in. And I wasn't too sure about this at first, but I think it just adds this nice little texture to this part. For this pad, I'm using the Silent 1 synth, and this has a few of its own built-in effects, like it has its own built-in reverb, has its own built-in mixer, oscillator, and all of that stuff. So this has a preset of synth pad that I'm using for this that automatically puts in that arpeggiation, and it comes out with this really cool sound.
Thank you for trying this demo.
And of course, I'll need to upgrade from the demo version when I can afford it. The next thing I have up here is what I like to call rhythm, and I'm not sure if that's the correct name for it, but it's the other bits of music and MIDI data that I do that doesn't quite fit into the other categories. And this is how it sounds for this track. So I've got 2 tracks going on here. I've got this cool Silent preset that has this nice arpeggiator. And then with it, I have my little electric keyboard that plays on the left channel during this part. And this might look weird because yeah, the MIDI data itself is not very complicated, but you can hear a lot more than what you see. And that is with the MIDI Arpeggiator plugin. And this has a few different presets, but I tend to just pick something that kind of sounds cool to me, and then I'll stick with it and just play whatever notes come to mind. So with the arpeggiator active, I can actually hold down a few of these notes and it'll automatically arpeggiate between them all, like this. And if I hold down one note, it'll do this. And there's a few different options you can also do. You can change how many octaves it'll range. So if I go all the way up, it'll sound really wacky. And if I go all the way down, it'll stay pretty monotone. And there's a few other settings as well, but I just left it on this for this track. And again, on their own, they might not sound impressive, but with the rest of the track, they sound like this. Now, one of the most important parts of a track like this is the bass. I think without bass, it just sounds flat and lifeless. So with the bass, I tried to just play something that kind of complemented the chords, and I have 3 different bass tracks that I've used. We'll start with this middle one here, because this is the easiest one to listen to. I picked this upright jazz bass preset because it had this pluckiness to it, and I wanted that to come through in the mix because the bass can be hard to hear sometimes, especially with the rest of the song going on. So I wanted to pick an instrument that had very clear notes, like you could hear when the note started. So I picked the jazz preset for that. I also have this other preset that I play over the top, which covers more of the high frequencies, and it sounds like this. So it sounds a bit weak on its own, and that's because I've cut out a lot of the low end frequencies, and I've tried to boost it around the mids and a bit of the highs there. The main purpose of this track is to give more fuzziness and warmth to the rest of the bass. So on its own, it doesn't sound great, but with the rest of it, it brings it to life. This is the more important part of the bass, which is the sub-synth bass preset I use, and this does most of the heavy lifting. Problem is, it's a little bit difficult to hear because it covers a very low frequency range, so it may not come through that well, but it sounds like this. I also added some EQ on it as well to really boost those low frequencies. And on normal headphones, it may not sound great, but if you put this with a speaker system with a subwoofer, this is where the subwoofer will be put to use. So there's the layout of the track, and this is how it sounds. So that is the latest track for Project Feline. I still have a lot of experimenting to do in regards to what direction I want to take the music in, so I'm going to be working on more demos throughout development, exploring different kinds of feels and different sounds. So if you don't want to miss that, be sure to subscribe to this channel to follow the development journey, or follow my Twitch to see the development of this game live. You can also check out all of my previous demos on SoundCloud. Big thank you to my patrons for supporting these videos. Sign up to my Patreon link down below and get exclusive Project Feline merch, access to my private Discord, and your name in the credits of these videos. It's completely optional, but your support really means a lot. It allows me to spend more time documenting the development of Project Feline. And if you want more updates, follow Project Feline on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks for following my development journey, and I'll see you next time.